Nobody expected this. While headlines fixate on China or the EU, something far more disruptive is happening quietly at America's doorstep. Canada and Mexico, long considered the US's most dependable trade allies, are now walking away, not with press conferences or fanfare, but with deals, ports, and supply chains that no longer point north. As U.S. tariffs surge and trade tensions rise, these two nations are building a future that no longer depends on Washington, and it's unfolding faster than anyone expected. Welcome to Geo Capitalist, where we decode global wealth, one power shift at a time. Today we're diving into a seismic twist. Canada and Mexico just ditched U.S. trade, and what comes next could redraw North America's economic map. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because in a world of distractions, we follow the money, the infrastructure, and the alliances that shape the next decade. Let's break it down. For decades, North America operated under a fragile but functional trade rhythm, one where the U.S. led and Canada and Mexico followed. That rhythm has now broken. In early 2025, the United States reinstated a sweeping round of tariffs, targeting sectors like steel, automobiles, and green energy components, measures officially designed to protect American workers, but unofficially viewed as a provocation. The message from Washington was clear: cooperation is conditional. What followed was not quiet compliance, but quiet recalibration. Both Mexico and Canada, instead of bending, began exploring options. Political leaders in Ottawa and Mexico City described the tariffs as a betrayal of partnership and initiated internal reviews of their trade exposure to the U.S. market. The shift wasn't immediate, it was strategic. What made this moment different wasn't the tariffs themselves. Tariffs have come and gone in U.S. politics. What changed was the erosion of trust. For Mexico, the uncertainty threatened its nearshoring boom. For Canada, it signaled the end of any special status in Washington's economic orbit. Trust, once broken, becomes a liability in trade. In diplomatic circles, Canada quietly revived talks with European trading blocs, while Mexico doubled down on expanding port infrastructure to reroute its exports eastward. Both nations realized something critical. Relying too heavily on the U.S. exposed them to not just economic risk, but political volatility. The assumption that geography guaranteed cooperation was shattered, and in its place, a new strategy began forming, one that didn't center around Washington at all. As tensions with Washington escalated, Canada made a quiet but decisive move. It began shifting its trade weight toward Europe. At the center of this pivot is the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, a deal that had sat underutilized for years. But now, Ottawa is giving it new life. In recent months, Canada has expanded export channels to Germany, France, and the Netherlands, with particular focus on sectors Washington once dominated: clean tech, rare earth minerals, and advanced manufacturing components. And the timing isn't accidental. Europe, desperate to decouple from volatile suppliers and accelerate its energy transition, has found in Canada a stable, resource-rich alternative. The numbers support the shift. Bilateral trade between Canada and the EU surged by over 25% year-on-year, with green energy materials leading the charge. Lithium from Quebec, nickel from Ontario, and clean hydrogen pilot programs in Alberta are now being packaged for export, not to the U.S., but across the Atlantic. And it's not just about energy. Digital trade, pharma, and AI development hubs are also part of this new strategy. Behind closed doors, Canada is redefining itself not as America's backyard, but as Europe's northern gateway. What makes this more than a trade adjustment is its diplomatic tone. Canada isn't framing this as retaliation, it's calling it diversification. But the message is clear. If the U.S. plays economic hardball, Ottawa will play smart. The idea that Canada is forever tethered to American trade infrastructure is now outdated. What's emerging is a green corridor, not southbound to Detroit, but eastward to Rotterdam. While Canada looked east to Europe, Mexico turned west, toward Asia and the rising economic bloc reshaping global trade, BRICS. For years, Mexico's manufacturing base was seen as a natural extension of American supply chains. But recent developments reveal a new ambition: to become a standalone export power with diversified routes that bypass the U.S. entirely. In 2025, Mexico finalized major infrastructure partnerships with South Korea, India, and Brazil, quietly backed by Chinese capital. The centerpiece? A multi-billion-dollar expansion of Pacific ports like Lázaro Cárdenas and Manzanillo, equipped with smart logistics and direct shipping lanes to Shanghai, Mumbai, and Jakarta. This isn't just about ports, it's about signaling. By modernizing its Pacific gateways and inviting BRICS-aligned investment, Mexico is telling the world it doesn't need to play second fiddle to Washington. A new generation of Mexican leaders, many of whom came of age during NAFTA's volatile years, are increasingly focused on building resilience, not dependence. And with Asia projected to account for over 50% of global GDP by 2030, the logic is clear. This new alignment is already paying off. BRICS plus nations now make up 32% of Mexico's non-U.S. trade volume, the highest in history. And while American officials continue to praise near-shoring, they're missing a key detail. Mexico isn't just near-shoring to the U.S. anymore. It's multi-shoring, with Asia, South America, and Africa all rising in priority. In public, Mexican officials speak diplomatically, but in strategy sessions, there's growing confidence. Mexico is no longer just an appendage of U.S. trade. It's becoming a hub of its own, one container ship at a time. On paper, the North American Trade Agreement still exists. In 2020, NAFTA was replaced by the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. And for a brief moment, it seemed like a modern upgrade to a decades-old system. But just 5 years later, the spirit that once animated the North American alliance is gone. What was once built on mutual benefit has now become a tug-of-war over domestic politics, legal disputes, and shifting loyalties. Canada and Mexico are still technically partners, but functionally they're competitors, and Washington is treating them like outsiders. The trade tension began to escalate when the U.S. imposed sector-specific tariffs on Canadian steel and Mexican auto parts, citing national security concerns. These moves, while legally framed, were politically charged and deeply damaging. Canada responded with WTO challenges and countermeasures on U.S. agricultural exports. Mexico filed formal complaints over energy market interference and unfair labor enforcement. The result? A trade bloc that functions more like a series of managed conflicts than a unified market. Behind the scenes, analysts have begun calling USMCA NAFTA 2.0 in name only. The institutional mechanisms still exist: dispute panels, tariff rate quotas, and joint working groups, but the trust that made the system work has eroded, and trust in trade is everything. With the U.S. presidential election now behind us and Canada's federal election having taken place in April 2025, both countries are entering new political chapters. But instead of alignment, we're seeing rising economic nationalism on both sides of the border. And that's making the idea of a cohesive North American future feel more fragile than ever. What we're witnessing isn't the collapse of an agreement. It's the quiet unraveling of a vision. The belief that geography alone could bind three nations together in permanent economic harmony. That illusion is fading fast. As the cracks in North American trade deepen, other global powers aren't watching from the sidelines. They're stepping in. For Europe, the fragmentation of the US-Canada-Mexico trade triangle opens a strategic lane, one where Canadian resources and expertise can serve EU industrial policy directly. The EU's appetite for critical minerals, clean tech components, and stable trade partners has made Canada a rising star. Brussels is now fast-tracking bilateral deals that bypass US bottlenecks entirely. CETA, once dormant, is seeing renewed investment, regulatory harmonization, and state-backed incentives for Canadian exporters. Meanwhile, China, often portrayed as the outsider in Western trade, has quietly become a key beneficiary of Mexico's diversification. Bilateral trade between the two countries rose 23% in the last fiscal year. Chinese electronics firms have opened new facilities near Guadalajara. Infrastructure funding for Mexican ports and highways, previously limited to domestic or North American capital, now comes from state-linked Chinese lenders. It's not just commerce, it's positioning. And then there's South America. As Brazil ramps up its BRICS leadership and Argentina eyes digital trade corridors, both nations are leaning toward deeper integration with Mexico's Pacific infrastructure and Canada's financial institutions. What once felt like a hemispheric divide is becoming a web of new alignments, ones that place the U.S. on the periphery rather than the center. For decades, Washington assumed that if it led, others would follow. But in this new reality, global players are treating Canada and Mexico not as junior partners, but as sovereign nodes in a fractured system. And the more they invest, the harder it becomes to reverse. Trade doesn't shift on policy alone. It moves on concrete, steel, and silicon. And while headlines often focus on tariffs or treaties, the real signal of long-term change is what's being built. Across North America, both Canada and Mexico are now re-engineering their infrastructure to reduce reliance on the United States, not just rhetorically but physically. In Canada, new port expansions on the Atlantic coast, particularly in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, are being designed to optimize shipping lanes to Europe, bypassing the U.S. eastern seaboard. The Port of Halifax, for example, is undergoing a $2 billion modernization project backed by a consortium of European logistics firms. At the same time, Alberta's clean hydrogen corridors are being connected to export terminals with end users in Germany and the Netherlands, not Chicago or Houston. Even telecom cables, once routed through the U.S., are now landing in direct EU connections. A subtle but powerful shift in digital sovereignty. Mexico's transformation is even more aggressive. The interoceanic corridor of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, a massive rail and port system linking the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific, is nearing completion. This corridor offers Asia to Atlantic shipping routes that completely bypass U.S. territory. Backed by South Korean engineering and Brazilian funding, it positions Mexico not just as a supplier, but as a global transit hub. The symbolism is hard to miss. Pipelines that once flowed north are now curving east and west. Fiber optic cables are rerouting. Export terminals are facing away from the U.S. mainland. Canada and Mexico aren't just adjusting policies, they're redrawing the economic map. And once built, these systems don't reverse. They compound. For decades, Washington operated on a quiet assumption that geography equals loyalty, that simply by sharing borders, Canada and Mexico would forever prioritize American economic interests. But in 2025, that assumption is unraveling. The U.S. still holds immense power. Its market size, currency dominance, and defense footprint are undeniable. But what's changing is the belief that American leadership is permanent or even reliable. Mexico and Canada have seen two major U.S. trade disruptions in just one decade. First, under Trump, now again under a return to hardline tariffs. From their perspective, the U.S. has become predictably unpredictable. And in trade, unpredictability is risk. So they're diversifying, not out of protest, but out of prudence. What Washington has misunderstood is the growing modularity of global trade. In the 1990s, regional integration was efficient. Today, it's optional. Nations can route digital services through subsea cables, finance infrastructure through BRICS banks, and sell energy to whoever pays best. The old model, where the U.S. sat at the center of every deal, is no longer guaranteed. Even American businesses are adjusting. Automakers in Detroit are seeking new suppliers in Brazil. Tech firms are bypassing regional rules by hosting data in Toronto or Monterey. The myth that the U.S. is irreplaceable is being tested, not with speeches, but with spreadsheets. And the more Washington leans on tariffs to assert control, the faster its neighbors accelerate away. Canada and Mexico are no longer asking how to rejoin America's orbit. They're asking whether it's still the right orbit at all. If the current trajectory holds, the North American trade bloc, once considered one of the most tightly integrated in the world, may become something far more fragmented. Not because of a single rupture, but because of 1,000 subtle recalibrations. A port reoriented toward Asia, a data center routed through Europe, a pipeline redirected to new markets. None of these alone signals a break, but together they form a pattern, one where Canada and Mexico are no longer looking to the U.S. for direction, but for distance. This isn't the collapse of trade, it's its realignment. And it's happening not through ideology, but through infrastructure, contracts, and quiet diplomacy. Washington may still believe it holds the steering wheel of North American commerce, but increasingly it's sitting in the back seat, while its neighbors redraw the map. The consequences are real. U.S. influence in regional energy markets is fading, its ability to enforce trade norms is weakening, and its assumption that partners will tolerate volatility is proving false. Meanwhile, new players, from Brussels to Beijing, are seizing the moment, offering alternatives that are less politically volatile and more globally aligned. So what happens next? Likely more fragmentation, more hedging, more trade lanes that don't lead to U.S. ports. The North American alliance won't collapse, but it may stop functioning as an alliance. And unless U.S. leadership evolves to meet this moment, Canada and Mexico may end up shaping the next phase of continental trade, with or without Washington's approval. If you found this breakdown valuable, watch our next video. It connects directly to what's unfolding. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support helps us decode these global shifts without compromise. Let us know in the comments. Is North America diverging or might be evolving? Either way, the world is watching. This was Canada and Mexico just ditched U.S. trade. Here's what's next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.